Guys, we might get started. For everyone joining online, is anyone able to react and tell me if you can hear me or not? Just give me some sign of life. Great. Brilliant. Okay, thank you so much. I appreciate that. I am going to be, just so you know, there's a few people in the room. There's also a good few people online. I think you will probably be online. A good few people were looking for the recording. All of that's fine, but it does mean my eye contact is going to be widespread, varied, and vague. So probably won't be looking at anyone specifically. So I'd appreciate your understanding around that. But thank you very much for taking your presumably lunch to be here and for showing interest. There was a great deal of interest in this. So there's someone trying to come in there. If you press the button at the side and then don't touch the door. Yeah, if you touch the door, it gets very temperamental and then stops. No, you're going to take your time. Come on in. We're just getting started anyway. And we'll do a few housekeeping bits anyway to kick us off. So online, you should be able to see the screen. You should also be able to see me, but realistically, it's just the slides you're probably going to need. So we'll just do a little bit of housekeeping items at the moment. So before we kick off, this session is going to be recorded, but I am going to do, hopefully have time for a little bit of a Q&A at the end. I usually in my recordings cut that bit out because people might have sensitive questions, you know, things come up. So for anyone who will get the recording, we are going to just cut that section at the end, but I'll send everyone the recording whether they attended or not, whatever that might be. I'm also going to warn you, there's a lot of text on screen for a few slides. It's not there because I expect you to read it, retain it whilst I'm talking at you. Absolutely not. It's there for your own interest to go back on after more than anything. So if you see quite a lot of text on screen at some point, try not to glaze over, essentially. I really appreciate it. I'm going to finish the session with some sample staff cases. These are incredibly fictional, entirely fictional. They're not even based around Trinity. They're more so around a conglomerate of people I know, my own experiences, different ideas to just try and illustrate a few points, okay? So if everyone is okay, we'll get started. For online, just to let you know, I have disabled the chat function purely because I find it extremely stressful trying to do a hybrid event and keep track of that. But I have enabled the Q&A. So if you do have any questions, like when they crop up throughout it, absolutely just pop them in there. And then at the end, I'll stop sharing the screen here so that no one can see what anyone has written and we can go through them at the end. So hopefully that's okay. Okay, so we'll go through what we're going to try and get through today. It's going to be a little bit of a, I suppose, whistle-stop tour of different things, which is introducing you to myself, why this session matters. Realistically, you've all taken the time to be here, so presumably you already know why the session matters. We're going to talk about the definitions of disability, what you need to know as an employer, realistically, and potentially personally, because I think it's maybe a little bit counterintuitive in my mind to separate disabled staff from line managers as if those two people don't overlap and those two groups can't be one and the same. We're also going to talk about reasonable accommodations that involving, I suppose, legal responsibilities that employers are required to take on board, and also just look at what a line manager's responsibilities are, but also what they're not. I think that can be a little bit confusing at times, which, you know, is completely fair. And some possible supports, and we'll look at some sample staff cases towards the end. But that's just give you kind of an overview of things. So to introduce myself, I will have probably met quite a few of you already. I'm autistic in the sense that I can't remember anyone's names or faces, but I will remember strange things like the tenor of someone's voice, which is lovely, but really unhelpful. So if I've met you, maybe I could have met you 3 or 4 times. It might be the first time again until someone introduces their name. So I'm sorry if I have met people already. But my name is Jen. I'm the Staff Disability Liaison Officer here in the Disability Service. I've worked here for a few years already. I primarily worked with the final year, third year students preparing for that transition to employment, and in the inclusive recruitment program or inclusive internship program, which I know some services who are attending and things will have taken part in. So I suppose I've been based in the DS for quite a while, but naturally it's quite different to transition into talking about staff specifically. I'm based a little bit between HR and the Disability Service, and also within the EDI office as well. So the idea, I think, of my role essentially is for it to be collaborative in nature, more so. The aim of my role is realistically to look at individual and institutional needs. I think we get all aware that some cultural change has to happen within Trinity in general, on a few fronts, but also around disability. But also then you have the individuals who need needs assessment, supports, all of those kind of things. But that's just to give you a bit of background. I have benefited from reasonable accommodations in the past. I've also experienced having them denied. I've had those experiences. So to me, it would probably never not be personal, but I don't think that of that as a detriment. I think of it as kind of keeping the person at the center of the story, realistically. So that's a bit of background on me. You can reach out at any time. And at the end, I'll put up the email address that we have and the dedicated inbox too. Okay, why this session matters. Realistically, anyone who's here probably knows why this matters, and I'm not doubting anyone's, I suppose, empathy or kindness, or essentially willingness to put out the hand and say, I don't know, but I don't even know what I don't know, which is completely fair. But that in itself takes a degree of awareness that I need to learn on this. But what we're trying to do, as much as I will be talking about a line manager's responsibilities, I will be talking about, the text on screen will be the legal stuff, and that'll feel heavy. What we're talking about is we're talking about our fellow humans. We're talking about people who have complex lives like ourselves, who need support, who, yes, we have a legal duty to do that, but we ultimately have, I would say, a moral responsibility to do that as people and as colleagues and as friends, presumably, in many of our cases. So I'm trying to bring this session in a way that is broad and helps you to understand what your responsibilities might be, the areas that you might want to ask questions about, but also personal, to understand that actually the individual in front of you might already be showing up to a conversation with you as their line manager thinking, I know I'm being such a bother. I'm being such a burden. This is difficult. X, Y, or Z. Or they come in defensive because their back's up because they've had a hard time already. We're just trying to get that personal level as well. So it's important for us to start with the definitions of disability, which I like to start with because I don't think there's ever going to be necessarily a perfect definition of disability, because how can you capture a whole nuanced scenario of experiences in there? However, it is important for us when we're looking at what Trinity as an employer has to do to look at that definition, because I am sure as line managers, many of us, at different times will certainly have had moments where we will not understand someone's disability or condition, or someone won't have disclosed, or then if they do, you're thinking, that is. And if it counts, the idea of accounting is quite a big thing in conversations. Oh, there we go. Person. So essentially, I suppose the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission realistically looks at it in different categories. It has to, for the sake of the UNCRPD, the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. Looks at physical, mental health, intellectual, sensory. You'll see different words used at different times, like cognitive, whatever, all of those different categories. However, that has to marry with Irish employment law. And Irish employment law takes that definition and takes the UN's definition, and then also adds that it can be an individual who's having a temporary condition, temporary injury, for example. We've had some staff members who are, they're 7 hours a day on their desk, but then they've broken a hand. And that's been, that's quite a disabling experience, and they need supports. Then we have to link it in with the Disability Act 2005, which looks at substantial restriction. And then once again, we're back to the Equality Act 2004, which says we need to look at actually the impacts in the workplace more than the diagnosis. So what you can see and what I'm trying to illustrate isn't so much that you need to retain all of these different categories, but that it is broad and that more people are entitled to support than they realize, essentially. And we are required and would benefit from giving these individuals support. I personally think it's worth noting that quite a lot of the disabled community and myself included, I wouldn't particularly like the idea of substantial restriction. It feels limiting because to me, and I mean, it goes back to 2005, so potentially it's fair enough and it's mildly dated, but substantial restriction means that it's substantial consistently. You know, I also have a chronic illness called Addison's disease, so I produce fairly negligible amounts of cortisol to deal with stress. I cope with that pretty well on a day-to-day basis, I think. But I'm substantially restricted if on the way into work, I accidentally, nearly get hit by a car and I get a little bit of a jump fright. That sets me back so significantly. And then my restriction has changed from a Monday to a Tuesday quite drastically. So this is something that disabled people have struggled with quite a lot and is coming up repeatedly around neurodivergent individuals, which I presume quite a lot of you have neurodivergent colleagues or neurodivergent yourself, whatever it might be. That the definition of substantial needs to also be flexible and change on a daily basis. So what I realistically want us to keep in mind is the idea that part of my role is trying to expand the definition of disability as it's understood across Trinity. We now have, I suppose, the onus is on us to get our numbers for disabled staff up to 6% by 2030. All public sector bodies have to get that. I would absolutely presume we have way more than 6% staff, but there's issues around disclosure, comfortability, stigma, all of those issues, and people have different reasons for not disclosing, and that's completely understandable. But part of that and getting that number up means helping people to understand what counts as a disability. And that includes line managers. When a staff member tells you they're struggling, they themselves might not see themselves as disabled. Supporting staff members I've had, and students too, actually, have had varying reactions to people when you would say, how do you feel about your disability? Some people do overtly recoil from that. And once again, not my place to judge, no one's place to judge. They might see it as a health condition they have well managed, might see it as personal circumstance, personal experience, doesn't need to be categorized in that way. All of that is relevant for the individual's understanding of self and for our ability to go ahead and respect them. But for the supports that they can receive, that umbrella word is actually quite the umbrella here. And I usually explain that to staff because we have staff that come that are quite maybe a bit unsure about different supports they can get at the start. So the Employment Equality Acts, when they were revised, they were most recently revised in 2025, I think, slightly, but mostly in 2015. It really reiterated the idea that we have to look at the barriers in the work environment and not so much the diagnosis. I think we maybe all have an experience of, or at least have somebody in our lives who has had an experience where they're chasing a diagnosis for something. They have this health condition, it's impacting their life, but if they're in the public sector, they don't know how long it'll take, to get, or in the public service to get a referral to a particular consultant, whatever it might be. It doesn't matter. Part of the definition of disability within the Employment Equality Acts is a disability or condition that's developing as well. So if someone does not have a diagnosis, that doesn't matter. They're still entitled to support, even if they don't have the name. So we have to look at it in terms of the barriers. The barriers essentially, I suppose, naturally we do have physical barriers, particularly Trinity is a historic campus. It's beautiful, we love it, but it also limits what we can change, what we can adapt, as we're trying to preserve, I suppose, preserve history, but we need to serve the people who are here right now and need support. They're also organizational and attitudinal in how we approach different people. I have had very varying reactions from staff members when I've said, okay, how would you feel if we brought your line manager into the conversation about this? And I think the varying levels of reactions of being comfortable, not being comfortable, to me indicates very broadly the work I need to do here, because the line managers whose intentions are solid are usually trying their best. The line managers who appear on the front not to be doing their best, I don't think it's because they don't want to. I think it's usually because they're maybe unsure of what they need to do and it's never happened before. They don't have the information, whatever it might be. But it is classified as a barrier, can be not just in their job, but also in recruitment. in terms and conditions, for example, in training, promotion and dismissal. So lately I've been doing some work with HR on, for example, changes to probation forms, because someone's probation and someone's performance during that period, disability is incredibly relevant for the context. But once again, how do you have that conversation if you've never structured it? So we need to work on all of these things. So reasonable accommodations. Broadly, you can think of reasonable accommodations as practical changes to reduce or remove barriers for someone to be able to work effectively. That's a fairly solid definition in terms of the practicalities on the day-to-day, is what do we change? However, this is where there's going to be a bit of text coming up, is we're going to look at, I suppose, what it is legally and what you need to be aware of. So the Equality Act 2004 has two elements when it looks at reasonable accommodations. And the two elements have to interact with one another. So essentially, it says that an employer does not have to recruit, promote, or retain someone who's not fully competent and able to undertake the work attached to the position as advertised. That's fair. However, the Employment Equality Act also has the Equality Act 2004 has the second element, which continues directly after, to say, however, where that person will be fully competent to undertake those duties with the provision of reasonable accommodations, they need to be put in place for equal opportunity. I think people get a little bit hesitant around the idea of equal. I see it a lot in relation to remote working, for example, which is our constant challenge. Is some people needing remote working for health reasons, sensory reasons, whatever it might be. How do I explain that to the rest of the team? What am I meant to say to them? All very fair questions, but the legal priority is on the individual's needs right there, right then. The only instance where someone doesn't have to pursue reasonable accommodations or look at different options is where it would impose disproportionate burden on the employer. What this generally means is burden means a burden that's disproportionate regarding operations, really disruptive to operations, or financially. So for example, if you have a really small business and someone needs a reasonable accommodation that is woefully expensive, that might be considered a disproportionate burden. But as you can imagine, legally, whether someone works in the disability service, they work in HR, they work in academic registry, they're in an academic department, Trinity is the employer overall. So Trinity's money and capabilities are behind it, not that individual departments, even though we're all dealing with our independent funding limitations realistically and kind of financial barriers and things. We still have to look at Trinity as the overall employer. So knowledge from the employee. This is one which I think comes up significantly from line managers is, I haven't been told anything, but I know maybe the individual is struggling with X, Y, and Z. I know that they might be autistic, they might be whatever, something's going on, but they haven't said anything. But then if that individual then states, for example, at any point later in their career around probation, for example, that they didn't receive support, the onus is on the employee themselves to disclose honestly to the employer. They maybe don't have to disclose the whole story, but they have to disclose enough information to let someone act practically. So you're not expected to be mind readers. There is only so much you can know, and there's only so much you can probe into, which I think we all know, but you are entitled to that degree of honesty if there's an expectation that reasonable accommodations need to be put in place. However, one bit of wording you'll see regularly in legislation and different kind of advice resources is that the process of implementing reasonable accommodations for an individual has to be interactive and collaborative. That phrase comes up quite a lot. It ultimately was too vague in the initial drafts of the Employment Equality Acts, but they had to hammer it home a little bit more to essentially what it means is that changes can't be made that are going to have an impact on operations that the line manager isn't aware of. The line manager has to be made aware of different things that come up. So that's where having, knowledge of a worker's disability, if someone has disclosed something to you and you're aware they're struggling, and you have not taken that dialogue further with them, that is a misstep on a line manager's behalf. Because if you have knowledge of a disability, once again, they might not consider it a disability. They might say, oh, I have endometriosis. It's bad, but I manage it myself. But you are aware they're struggling quite a bit, it's difficult, or their arthritis is really impacting how well they can type and things like that. And they've disclosed this to you. It's your responsibility to have a confidential, supportive conversation further, to make them aware of the supports available. It's not your responsibility to fix everything, but the onus is on you to do something with the knowledge you now have. Okay? So what does an interactive collaborative process even look like? It's a hard balance, because where I sit as a Staff Disability Liaison Officer, essentially, is I sit between the Disability Service and HR and within the EDI office, where we need to make sure that staff members who are potentially disclosing very sensitive things feel like they can do that in a way that isn't going to be immediately reported back to HR. They could have had a grievance with HR in the past. There could be, I don't know, unions could be involved in something completely unrelated in the past. It doesn't matter to me, and I need them to be aware that my process is independent of that. However, we still need to make it extremely clear to the staff member that if they need certain reasonable accommodations that are going to be put in place that are going to maybe change things a little bit in the service, whether it might just be remote working, could be changes to furniture, assistive technology, whatever it is, we need to make the line manager aware. So it's a real mix of balancing that dialogue, and that's a lot of my job, is collaborating in that dialogue. So essentially, what it is involved in is reviewing the medical evidence provided, doing an independent needs assessment, and then one of the most important stages, which I do myself, is having a look after doing the needs assessment about, okay, I'm at so-and-so, looks like these kind of accommodations are going to need to be put in place. Looks like it's going to have a fairly high operational impact. Doesn't mean it's not doable, but I might need to have a conversation with line manager. I look at a proportional line manager engagement framework here and work through that flow. All that means essentially is that if a staff member comes and they need occupational therapy, for example, but no other supports in the workplace, their line manager does not need to know. That is not going to have an impact in the workplace. So I use that framework to guide that conversation. Again, there's no conversation being had with a line manager separately without the individual themselves being aware first. That's the golden rule here that we have to keep to. Again, a lot of text, but realistically, this is just for people afterwards if they want to have a look at more details around the process from a staff member's perspective. They reach out, I request the relevant information, which is medical documentation. Irish legislation and the UN's legislation is a little bit vague, frustratingly, around medical evidence. It doesn't say has to be from a consultant, has to be from, a GP is sufficient, anything like that. It says from relevant medical practitioner. So obviously that's purposely vague, we can imagine. So that's when I have to review and see, for the seriousness of the condition, is the evidence, for example, could be 20 years old. Do we need something a bit more recent? And that's when we have the evidence of disability form. I review the documents, I meet them, I then decide line manager needs to be involved here, line manager doesn't. We draft what's known as an individual accommodation plan. Here we put in, it has essentially the support required, the rationale for it, the date of the needs assessment, how impactful it's likely to be. Is it required not on a continuous basis or is it a temporary one? And a review date. A review date's essential for me to meet with the staff member, say, is this being implemented? Is it working? Okay, it's not. We need to figure something else out. It's signed by the staff member first and then shared with the line manager. At this point, it's made extremely clear to the individual that nothing is in place until all parties have signed it. And then once line managers have signed it, that's where the responsibility of the line manager really kicks off in terms of making sure things are implemented and reviewed. I generally manage the reviews because I think it can be helpful to, have for a staff member to have somewhere third party essentially to go and to talk about any concerns they might have. But I also will meet sometimes with the line manager separately and say, how is it going? And they might say, it's actually working really well for Mary, but I have had some, you know, difficulties explaining it to the guys. I could do with some guidance on that, you know, and things, and that's completely understandable too. And that review session is also made available at that point to the line managers. Examples of reasonable accommodations. These are ones that we have pulled from, I've pulled from sample, I guess, individual accommodation plans. I think if you look at them, like over 70% of reasonable accommodations for staff members are free and are generally non-disruptive. I think when people hear reasonable accommodations, I think it's understandable if you feel a degree of, I don't know, like almost your chest gets a bit tight of going, how am I meant to put that in place? With the money I have, with the structure I have, with could be understaffing, could be resourcing issues, whatever happens. But instead, I would love if people's first response to reasonable accommodations was actually more broad and saying, oh, what is it actually? You know, let's not immediately panic. So we're looking at, you know, flexible working hours. So for example, for me, I start work at 8 and I finish at 4. Being autistic, I really struggle with the commute. I struggle with busy times. I take the Lewis and I really struggle with that. So for me, that actually has changed my ability to be present during the day, entirely. I wasn't aware that was an option until I started working here. Hybrid working arrangements were appropriate. For example, we have some staff members who are immune compromised and they have a hybrid working agreement where, you know, during times of the year where potentially a lot of people are sick in the office, I might need to work a bit remote at the time. That's okay, that's fine. We usually request medical evidence to state specifically that, but that's side details. Assistive technology, ergonomic equipment, a lot of that time that can be for home as well. Workload planning, deadlines. I think this is particularly prevalent when we have neurodivergent staff members, particularly younger neurodivergent staff members. I think, you know, you're joining the workforce. It's already new, it's already hard, everything is hard. And then you're unsure of the expectations being placed on you, and also what your deadlines are for everything. So also that kind of ties into the idea of having accessible meeting formats, written instructions or follow-up notes. Accessible meeting formats might mean having the option to, you know, if you have a team meeting, every second time we meet, it's going to actually be on time as well. Or the meeting format itself is structured inherently, that everyone knows when they're going to speak, how much is expected of them at any time. I think, and it's a phrase I've heard a little bit, not necessarily in Trinity, potentially, you know, from within my own family even, of, God, is that not a lot of hand holding? You know, how are people meant to do that? How are you meant to keep up with that? And my response is, what it is, I suppose it can be seen as additional effort. It can be seen as the willingness to be inconvenienced so that you support someone. I would say much more broadly, it is your duty to respect a fellow human being with what they need. And what has it cost you, really, that kindness? And besides any of that, at a higher level, which I don't love bringing into it, but on a higher level, no disabled staff member is reliant on your empathy or kindness because they are legally entitled to these supports. It's excellent if we can do it through empathy and kindness. But at the end of the day, the protections are there. Changes to workspaces is a large thing around kind of lots of times, like, can I wear my headphones, noise cancelling headphones? Some offices are a little bit old school, don't like how that looks. You know, you're not available. And for staff members who use mobility aids, might be wheelchairs, might be whatever, we usually do a PEPR, personal emergency evacuation plan. This has been incredibly important recently within the fires and the fire, I shouldn't say fires, plural, fire and TBSI building, for example, where there were students as well who are wheelchair users. The plan has to be very clear about those evacuation plans. So those staff members, we really hope will make themselves known to us when they register, and they're brilliant, they do. So manager responsibilities. I would say a lot of what, and it's going to sound vague, it's going to sound annoyingly wishy-washy, is a lot of a line manager's responsibility when supporting a disabled staff member is holding space for that person. It feels like, for me, it felt like when I first disclosed to a line manager of mine, it felt like I started to hold my breath from the moment I'd said the words, and then I did not breathe until he spoke. I analysed every micro expression of his face to think, oh God, he thinks less of me now. My progression is stunted. That's not going to happen anymore. And I'm going to be viewed as less capable. I've just admitted I can't produce a stress hormone and I want to do a stressful job. I have all of this happening in 30 seconds. Whereas if you can create the environment when you're having that conversation, it's not about someone's work. You have changed someone's life because someone's reaction to your disability joins the narrative and the story of you, how you view yourself for the rest of your life. You'll never forget the doors that closed in your face. That does not mean you have to be perfect. It doesn't mean you have to, oh God, how do I talk about autism? How do I say X, Y, and Z? It doesn't matter. You have to be trying and you have to have a good intention. That's all that matters. Line managers I've had in the past have not gotten it perfect. I don't remember what they got exactly wrong. I don't care, but I know they showed up and they tried. Realistically, from there, once that's done, it's a lot about signposting supports, which is hence here, making yourselves aware of supports available and what's available and saying, and might just be, you know what, would you ever think of reaching out to the disability service? Or would you mind if I reached out to them and I said, I'm going to put you in touch with so-and-so, because that initial email might be too hard for them. It might be too hard. So it could be a case of saying, I'm just going to CC you into it and then I'm going to leave the conversation. Whatever it might be, you'll know that staff member yourself. Linking them in with HR, occupational health, for example, if someone has been out of work for whatever reason, as well. And then ultimately past that point, it's ensuring that they're implemented and reviewed. But also bear in mind what we've talked about. Any accommodations are not going to be agreed without you here. They'll be suggested and they'll be brought to the conversation for that collaborative, interactive conversation. So none of this will really come as a shock, to be honest. Instead, my mind is when I meet the individual, I'm trying to make sure they're comfortable with me. But then one of the very second things probably we're talking about is, and what's your relationship like with your line manager? And how would you feel if they were involved in this conversation? Generally, it's extremely positive, or it's simply just someone saying, Joe, I don't know what they think. It's usually not negative. It's usually, I don't know. I'm like, okay, let's try it. Let's have the conversation together and see how it goes. It's usually absolutely fine. What a manager's responsibilities are not, however, is, and sadly we do come across these, is diagnosing a condition. And this ties with the idea of assuming a disability. We see this more and more coming up, to be honest, around neurodiversity. I will have line managers reach out to me and they will say, I know that Tom on my team is autistic, I'm sure he's autistic and I wish I could support him, but I don't think he's diagnosed and we've never talked about it. But I'm a big fan of Tom, but I don't know how to support him, but he's definitely autistic. I think the heart of that is probably in the right place, because what I can appreciate is there's a lack of fear of approaching a conversation, and usually it's to try and get someone supports. However, one of the 9 grounds of discrimination is around disability, and that under that is categorized as assuming a disability. It doesn't matter if you're right or wrong. Don't step there. Just don't. Instead, you can ask an individual if you think they are struggling with something, and potentially you've jumped to conclusions in your head. And we all do that. We all have moments where we think things. Instead, what we can have is a conversation with them and say, I noticed you're struggling with X, Y, and Z. What's your experience of that? And talk to them about it that way and see what's their understanding of it from their perspective, because you're probably seeing a bit of a bigger picture. Or asking for unnecessary medical details. If someone discloses a medical condition, for example, we have a few staff members who have had cancer in the past, who've returned after having cancer, etc. And they have had quite invasive questions asked of them. And it's usually from the perspective of care, of saying, oh God, and how are you doing now? And can you do that? And is that actually diagnosed now? Or what do we, it's always from a point of care and saying, the more information I have, the better. I would say to protect yourself, keep it to what do you need to know to do your job as a line manager, and then let the disclosure up to them, because it goes back to that piece around knowledge from the employee. You can only know what they have shared with you. Everything else is not on your responsibility, really. Sharing disability related information with the team, that can be a hard one. I think this particularly does come up when we have teams where there might be hard and fast rules around things like remote working. And then we have someone who's suddenly remote 3 days a week. And it feels like that to everyone else, probably does feel, okay, where's Mary? We never see her anymore. Or she didn't have to wait till the end of her probation to get that. I don't understand. Typically, as part of the needs assessment process, when someone is signing off their individual accommodation plan, we have a whole section around comfortability around sharing. And that is to give the line manager direct guidance from the individual of saying, I'm okay with the team knowing I have an agreement, but I don't want them to know medical details. Like, we get into granular detail of that and guidance. Or I'll tell my line manager absolutely everything, but the director of the service, I'm a little bit hesitant there. I'm scared. So could we keep it vague there? Or all of those things. It's a long enough section that I go through with the staff member first, and then we share it with the line manager and see, do they have any queries about it, any questions? But there is a section on disclosure with colleagues and what that's like. So that is a conversation that you should hopefully have guidance on from the individual themselves. Until you have that guidance, though, I would put up with people's bad moods about not getting remote days. And I know it's difficult. I really do. And I also know I don't know how difficult it is, probably to that degree. Deciding whether a person is disabled enough for support, that is a phrasing that is coming up, to be honest, quite a lot, usually once again in relation to neurodiversity, now that there's an increase in late diagnosis, and people have different opinions about that. We hear a lot of like, my nephew's autistic and he can't speak, but sure, she's got a great job, so like she's grand. And again, I don't think that comes from a place of badness. In my mind, it comes from a lack of knowledge more than anything. But again, someone is not dependent on your kindness or your empathy when they have the legal protections to get that support. So it is not up to you to decide any of these or decide what medical details are necessary. Can you go back to your consultant and get another report on that? X, Y, and Z. That's not on you. Seek guidance. Genuinely seek guidance if you're unsure about it. The service is there for disabled staff, but there is also line managers do reach out frequently and say, can I ask for a bit of advice on this? And they usually keep the details anonymous of the individual, but we talk it through, and that's absolutely fine. So, sample staff cases. Realistically, I'm going to go through this kind of quickly because I'm hoping to take you through just a short story more than anything. And then we'll wrap up fairly soon and we'll have just some time for questions, and hopefully you guys will get out in time and everything. But I don't know, I presume a lot of people will have seen this before. HR put this online. I think it's in a lot of places. I love it. Declan, our director, gave me a poster of it recently because I talk about it so much, which is so true, and I was thrilled. But essentially, it is the life cycle of a TCD employee. You do have your new starter, you have someone who learns, someone progresses, you might stay and move on, you might retire, whatever it might be. There's the equivalent one for students, and that was the one I was originally more familiar with. But the employee one, I think, is what matters for us in this conversation. So, okay, so we're going to have a conversation here about a new starter. We're at the start of that cycle, and we have Anna here. And Anna she's a few years into work relatively. She's not a new grad, but she's still quite young. She's new to starting here in Trinity. She's on admin staff in an academic department. However, she's currently coming in on a temporary contract. It's casual engagement at the moment. She's coming in on an hourly rate at the moment. She's hoping it'll become something else, but we don't know. She's helping people, dig people out at the moment. Her direct manager is Gary. Gary's incredibly proactive and understanding around disability and supports. And they work under the head of department that we've kept purposely vague here. And the head of department has been there for a long time, is aware of Trinity's tenor and tone around change. I think we all know how difficult it can be to enact change in Trinity, but then when it starts, it can snowball, but it's usually getting that bit starting. So Anna is starting. She is really concerned, I suppose, around remote working, because what's her entitlement to that as casual engagement staff? She discloses to her line manager, Gary, that she is autistic, but she also has OCD, and this really impacts her anxiety levels. She has a rumination kind of OCD. She, as a result, is particularly high performing in work. Her work is excellent, but it does mean she has a great deal of anxiety within herself. So she discloses to Gary and says, Gary, I have these things going on. As a result, I do need to go to therapy every Tuesday morning at this time. Can I work remote that day and maybe one more day a week just to help minimize the sensory overload. Gary's incredibly understanding, proactive. However, he can feel himself tensing up a little bit at the thought, because he now needs to discuss this further up, because he is aware that this might not go down that well for no other reason except cultural differences and how things have always been done in this department. Gary himself, however, and Anna's noticed, has remote working days when a lot of people don't. Not just because he's permanent staff, but she doesn't know that. It's actually because he had a traumatic brain injury a couple of years ago. He, as a result, needs to go to physio a few days a week. So he really appreciates what she's dealing with. He's had to kind of fight for those supports, and ultimately is going to do his utmost as a line manager to engage with, say, the disability service, to understand his legal requirements to support Anna and how we can get this across the line. But it is something that he himself just feels a little knot in his stomach, thinking, oh God, how do I get that across the line? When you have a human being in front of you who, we should be able to do that. I just don't understand. I think these are the kind of cases we're dealing with in Trinity, is we've hard and fast things, but we also have the vague cultural changes that need to happen in Trinity. So Anna stayed here for a while. She has discovered with Gary, she's talked to the disability service, she's found out that even if she's on an hourly contract or she's on casual engagement, she's entitled to the exact same supports as a permanent staff member. The only issue is that it's generally harder for casual staff to engage in those because they might not be around long enough to see the process through. So if you have staff, for example, who are maybe temporary staff or whatever it might be, I would encourage, if you identify a disability, they come to you, they disclose, to try and get that process started fairly early into their employment. I will absolutely prioritise them, but otherwise they're entitled to the exact same level of supports. Anna's learned this with Gary, they got supports, and as a result, like that, they didn't have to rely on the head of department's empathy or kindness. They didn't have to rely on the cultural understanding of the department, because we have what she is legally entitled to. The work can be done remotely. It is an admin job. Is there an operational relevance for her to be present? All of these things were asked. Medical evidence was looked at, all of those things. She does feel a little bit of tension, however, amongst the team when she works remotely, because the rest of them can't. And she's also on a temporary basis. She's not super sure. However, she isn't aware that at the same time, the head of department is receiving backlash about this. He is understanding in that he has to give this to Anna and ultimately wants to, but he is really struggling with this backlash. She's still not comfortable, however, to talk to the rest of the team. Gary knows the details, nobody else knows the details. Gary's done really well at fielding all of these different areas, but it is challenging. So as a result, Anna decides, I'm going to speak to the head of department myself, and I'm going to explain my conditions, explain what's going on. On top of it, she also explains that, or in that conversation, for example, the head of department says, a fixed term contract's coming up for this, actually, to take you off of casual pay. And your work is great. We want to keep you here. That's brilliant. And she thinks, excellent, that's amazing. And he says, but, we can just about do the remote days you're working, but we can't do much more than that. And she feels a knot in her stomach, thinking, is this where I need to be? I'm never not going to be autistic. I'm always going to struggle with anxiety, whether it's related to autism and my sensory needs or OCD at any given time. But for her, she decides, okay, I'll just be really honest with the head department. She also tells him, I do also have caring responsibilities. My adult brother, for example, he has high support needs. I'm his sole carer. I have to be there for him. And when I work remotely, it gives me time to go and pick him up from his day service on those particular days. Director is very understanding about this, but still says, we'll have to see what we can do. Ultimately, it gets across the line, but that's not the point, because the point is what had to happen to get it across the line. She had to disclose personal information that she did not have to. She felt as though she had to because of the culture and the environment of the place. Gary, realistically, probably felt like he didn't have control to make those decisions without the head of department's involvement. So what has happened is that the head of department has faced backlash from staff and that they didn't have to experience if the culture was different. Gary has had to field all of those questions, and now she has had to put herself on the line, absolute vulnerability. And she doesn't know if that's going to impact her progression going forward before she's ever signed a permanent contract in Trinity. None of that needed to happen, you know? These are the things we have to change. Yes, she gets her remote working days, and that's great, but instead we need to look at who's the next Anna coming in that we can resolve that with. So in a couple of years, Anna's now doing pretty well. A new head of department starts. The old one retired and is incredibly understanding, but also really open about her own experiences of, for example, experiencing menopause, what that's like impacting her in the workplace. So she's very keen to organise CPD and supports Gary and Anna in progressing, as opposed to kind of this fight to stay aloft, I guess, and above water. What this results in is at the life cycle later on, we have a new starter, and now Anna's the manager here. She's a manager for Chinara. Chinara has a fluctuating disability. She's a type of narcolepsy that's incredibly difficult. She's extremely guarded around explaining this because narcolepsy, they're going to think I'm lazy, they're going to think I'm falling asleep on the job, all of these kind of things. So her understanding of explaining a neurological condition and how that impacts her is going to be directly impacted by the reception she receives from Anna, which will have been impacted by Anna's own journey. So everything we need to do, we need to look at the cycle and how that is. So that's where what I'm trying to say, I suppose, constantly is my role is institutional and individual. It's a constant rollout of change, but looking at the granular level because the person in front of you matters. I know that everyone here knows that. I know if anyone chose to turn up and spend their lunch doing this, they absolutely know that. What I would like people to walk away with more than anything is confidence to seek help or seek guidance in this. If you have a staff member and you think, I have no idea what to do with him, or how do I get that support across the line, or whatever I think we could do with formalizing that, seek support, get guidance, get help. It doesn't have to be, you're not expected to be all knowing on it. So in terms of possible future sessions, because at the end of the day, this role is relatively new. It's very new. It's extremely new. It started in February. It's extremely new. I would like to continue these sessions incrementally. I ran a session recently for disabled staff members themselves. My aim is to kind of dot these throughout the year at lunchtimes and see, because obviously we'll have new starters the whole time, but also hopefully awareness will get out there. But I would like to do different sessions for line managers. I'll probably send you guys a bit of a feedback form to ask you if there's things you'd like to do. These are just some of the things that have come up with people. People have asked about inclusive language. How do I talk about things? Responding supportively to a staff member's ability to carry out their role when that changes. You know, for example, you could have someone who works in, you know, estates and facilities, and they have a knee operation, for example. Now their ability to do their role has changed. What do we do in those instances? Do we redistribute the tasks? Do we rescope? What do we do? But you don't want to respond in the incorrect way. So maybe a lot of the time, I think a lot of us freeze as opposed to responding in the way that we would like to represent actually the empathy we have for the person. And then also another one is responding directly to disclosure. I think that requires a session in itself. So I didn't want to get too heavy into it today. I'm really just trying to introduce you to myself mainly. And this is the email, but you will be getting an email from me from this address anyway after this with the recording and stuff. So you can always follow up that email with any questions you have or anything.